The Apostle Paul concludes his first letter to the Corinthians with a stunning theological ultimatum. He declares that if Jesus Christ did not raise from the dead, then the entire Christian faith is nothing more than an exercise in vanity. In other words, Paul believes that if the resurrection of Jesus Christ did not historically occur, then Christians should stop all of their religious practice because the rest is pointless. With the highest stakes imaginable on the table, modern readers often open Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John with a hope that the Gospels will provide fully corroborated testimony about the resurrection. But the Gospels do not provide a resurrection corroboration. Instead, the Gospels create a resurrection contradiction.
To all the doubters, to those who don't believe, this is the hour. You'll see that we'll make ladders out of obstacles and stepping stones from roadblocks. Leap over the lines to say we won't cross. We'll trick canyons like they're nothing. They won't see us coming. Scale all of the walls they built to hold us.
All four of the Gospels contain competing chronologies of the events that unfolded on resurrection morning. All four of the Gospels record different names of the witnesses that first discovered the empty tomb. And all four of the Gospels remember different, mutually exclusive details about the angels who proclaimed the good news of the resurrection. If these contradictions feel disheartening today, remember that none of the Gospel writers lived in an era when modern journalistic standards existed. Editorial review boards, cross-referencing sources, and using data to verify reality are still millenniums away from being implemented into the way humans report and record events. Instead, the authors of the Gospels wrote about the human experience of resurrection to the best of their individual knowledge. Centuries later, the early church councils knew about these contradictions between the Gospels, and they still elected to include four distinct accounts of the resurrection rather than selecting the one that they believed to be the most correct. The wisdom of the early church councils teaches modern Christians that the work of God is best understood not through an authoritative individual, but through a diverse community. This wisdom extends to the contradictions of Scripture, because contradictions are ultimately about the inclusion of differing human perspectives. And while there are times that one perspective is wrong and another perspective is right, the work of the church is to trust the tradition and believe that we can more fully comprehend God when we listen to each other. So rather than being disheartened by the contradictions of the resurrection, we should instead be looking at how the Gospels are both speaking and listening to each other as they remember the universe-shifting event of the resurrection. The best way to do this is to pay attention to what each individual gospel is saying first, and then comparing and contrasting each of these stories side by side. This process respects the individuality of each gospel and embraces the collective experience of all the writers, which reveals a more complete picture of the work of God. With that goal in mind, let's turn to the first gospel.
To all the doubters, to those who don't believe, this is the hour, you'll see.
The Gospel of Matthew tells us that there were two women who went to the tomb on Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene and, quote, the other Mary. When they both arrived, a stone covered the tomb. Suddenly, an angel with an appearance like lightning descended from heaven to earth. This angelic motion caused an earthquake to shake the ground. Then the angel rolled back the stone, sat on top of it, looked at the women, and told them about the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
They will make ladders out of obstacles and stepping stones from roadblocks. Leap over the lines to say we won't cross. We'll trick They won't see us coming. Scale all of the walls they built to hold us.
The Gospel of Mark remembers 3 women who traveled to the grave of Jesus on that day: Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome. On their way, they wondered how they might roll away the stone to anoint the body of Jesus. But when they arrived, the stone had already been rolled to the side of the tomb. The 3 women went into the grave and saw just one angel waiting for them there. This angel then told them about the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
To all the doubters, to those who don't believe, this is the hour, you'll see.
The Gospel of Luke says that at least 5 women traveled to the tomb on resurrection morning. He records Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and then, quote, the other women. The stone was already rolled to the side when these 5 women arrived. Perplexed, the women walked inside and found the tomb to be completely empty. Suddenly, multiple angels appeared right beside them in the grave and told them about the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
They will make ladders out of obstacles and stepping stones from roadblocks. Leap over the lines to say we won't cross. We'll trick canyons like they're nothing. They won't see us coming. Scale all of the walls they built to hold us.
The Gospel of John relays that only one woman initially witnessed the resurrection: Mary Magdalene. When she arrived, the stone had already been rolled away. She immediately ran back to Peter and John to tell them that grave robbers stole the body of Jesus. Mary Magdalene, Peter, and John ran back to the tomb and found that it was still empty. This confused all of them, and Peter and John returned home. However, Mary stayed behind. She wept at the entrance of the tomb. And then through her tears, she saw 2 angels sitting on opposite ends of the stone where the body of Jesus once lay. At that moment, Jesus appeared next to her, and she saw the resurrected Christ for herself. The Gospels struggle to produce a consistent list of the witnesses who first discovered the empty tomb of Jesus or who witnessed the resurrection firsthand. However, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all agree on one thing: Mary Magdalene was definitely there. She is the consistent biblical presence of Resurrection Sunday. Chances are, if you lived in first century Palestine and met Mary Magdalene, then the reputation that preceded her would have been the woman who first discovered the empty tomb of Jesus. The tragedy of her story is that most Christians today are completely unaware of that reputation for Mary Magdalene. Instead, Christians tell the world that Jesus first encountered Mary Magdalene as a scorned prostitute and then liberated her from her life of sex work. But Mary Magdalene is not described as a prostitute anywhere in the Bible. That reputation can be traced back to the year 591 CE, when Pope Gregory I delivered a homily in Rome. In that sermon, the Pope declared that Mary Magdalene and Mary, the sister of Martha, were the same Mary, even though Luke and John make a clear distinction between these 2 Marys. To make matters worse, the Pope then said that this hybrid Mary was also the same as the unnamed sinful woman who anointed the feet of Jesus in Luke chapter 7. The Pope brought his homily home by declaring that if God could forgive someone as sinful as Mary Magdalene, then God could surely love and forgive you. Not long after that, the Christian tradition, led almost exclusively by men, discarded her reputation as resurrection witness and fully embraced her new reputation as forgiven prostitute. 500 years after Mary Magdalene witnessed the empty tomb and told the world that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, men silenced her testimony and reduced her to a side character in the history of Christianity. This is a sin of the patriarchy. Christians must work against this sin and work to dispel the incorrect reputation of Mary Magdalene as a forgiven prostitute. Christians must then reclaim her original title which can be found in the Gospel of John. John's Gospel records that when Mary Magdalene looked inside the tomb, she saw two angels. One angel sat at the head of the stone where Jesus' body laid, and the other angel sat at the foot of the stone. This imagery meant something in John's culture. This is the image of the Ark of the Covenant. And during John's lifetime, the Ark of the Covenant was not a relic that only appeared in movies. The Ark was a real sculpture that resided in the most holy place in the temple in Jerusalem. The most holy place served as a throne room for God, and the people of Jerusalem viewed this room as overwhelmingly holy. So holy, in fact, that only one human being could be considered worthy to enter that throne room and stand in the presence of God. That person was the high priest. Now imagine seeing the event of the resurrection through John's eyes. In his gospel, a lone person enters an enclosure where two angels sit on top of a flat surface. The angels represent the Ark of the Covenant, and the tomb represents the most holy place, signifying that there has been a significant change in leadership. And Mary Magdalene is now the high priest. Up until this day, only men could serve as priests, let alone the high priest of the temple in Jerusalem. And then resurrection happened. Mary Magdalene testified that she saw the resurrected Christ, and John realized that resurrection changed everything. Death no longer had the final word, and men no longer had an iron grip on the priesthood. But the story of Mary Magdalene is just the beginning of the story of resurrection. While John claims that Mary Magdalene traveled to the grave alone, the other three Gospels dispute that record and tell us that she traveled with others. As noted earlier, these Gospels disagree on which individuals accompanied Mary Magdalene. But between all of the contradictions of these Gospel accounts, all of these companions shared something in common. They were all women. What begins by focusing on the individual authority of Mary Magdalene quickly transposes to the collective feminine experience. This contradiction teaches us that the message of resurrection begins not when one extraordinary woman speaks out or when one woman is given a title typically reserved for men. Instead, the message of resurrection begins when women are empowered to testify about the risen Christ. Collectively, the Gospels teach us that the only way the world knew about the earth-shattering event of the resurrection is because women stood up and preached while men sat down and listened. This empowering idea can be discovered by allowing the biblical contradictions of the resurrection to serve as our teachers. When isolated, John's Gospel unveils the progressive reality that Mary Magdalene is the first high priest of Christianity. And when considered collectively, the Gospels in unison expose the sins of the patriarchy and declare that women compose the priesthood of the resurrection. This is a direct inspiration and an urgent challenge to the church today to actively work against the sin of sexism. This is the work of God, as taught to us by Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, Mary the mother of James, Joanna, Salome, and the other women who witnessed the empty tomb on Sunday morning.
They may be blind to me, just wait and see.